Today we are with Professor Peter Adamson. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We will try to elucidate some points about Islamic philosophy with your expertise and maybe try to give an introduction to Islamic philosophy or whether we should talk about something as Islamic philosophy. I can give the word to you if you wish.
Well, so maybe we should start with that phrase, Islamic philosophy. There's been some controversy about this. It was maybe more of a debate when I first was in the field, so now like 20 years ago or something. There was, back then it was quite a big debate about whether to call the field Islamic philosophy or Arabic philosophy. And there were kind of points made for and against both. So the main argument for Arabic philosophy was, first of all, that the texts are mostly in Arabic. Something that we have to mention here, because people always get confused about this, is that when we talk about Arabic here, we mean the Arabic language. So it has nothing to do with Arabs, because of course a lot of philosophers who wrote in Arabic were not Arabs, right? So that was one argument in favor of Arabic. Maybe a deeper point there is that a lot of the works are somehow emanating from the translation movement from Greek into Arabic. So the phrase Arabic philosophy maybe highlights that, the role of the translation movement, the fact that a lot of the tradition is about the reception of Greek philosophy in the Arabic-speaking world, and so on. Another point against Islamic philosophy, so in favor of Arabic philosophy, was that quite a few of the thinkers we're interested in here were not Muslims. So we have Christian philosophers writing about Aristotle, like, say, Yahya ibn Adi, who's a 10th century Iraqi Christian who writes commentaries on Aristotle, right? Or Maimonides, who's a Jewish philosopher who came from Muslim Spain and then worked in Egypt. So he lives in the Islamic world, but he's not a Muslim. And if you want to include these figures, and why wouldn't you, then it seems kind of strange to say that you're talking about Islamic philosophy, right? Against Arabic philosophy, we have the problem that some of the works in question, especially later on, are written in Persian. So actually the highlighting of the Arabic language is problematic. And I think also that deeper point about the importance of the translation movement was felt by some to actually be a disadvantage of Arabic philosophy, because it kind of suggests that what's going on with this tradition is nothing other than a working through of ideas from the Greek tradition, which isn't really true, right? So eventually this all went away, this debate, because people eventually started just using the phrase philosophy in the Islamic world, which is also what I use, right? And basically that takes a step back and says, well, we're just talking about philosophy of any kind that happens in this geographical, political realm. And Islamic world would mean sort of just the regions of the world that were under Islamic domination, or where Islam is culturally a majority religion or something like that, from basically the beginnings of Islam until now, right? And I think there's a lot of advantages to that. One is that it avoids this whole kind of, to my mind, ultimately not very useful debate. And the other thing is that it marks out what we're interested in really as a geographical issue. So just as you can talk about European philosophy or philosophy in China, you can talk about philosophy in the Islamic world. So that's, I think, kind of what has won out now.
Would you say there is a direct influence of the religion in this tradition, or it is just as how any other group of people would approach to these Greek philosophers? Yeah,
well, I think that's actually another advantage of the phrase philosophy in the Islamic world, because, okay, so the word Islamic obviously alludes to a religion, but it alludes to it in a way that's pointing to it as a kind of geographical distinction, right? So just as you can speak of Christian Europe, and a lot of people who live in Christian Europe or Christendom weren't Christians. So you have the Islamic world, and a lot of people who lived in the Islamic world, including philosophers, were not Muslims. And so you're, in a way, leaving open the question of how important Islam is for any one philosopher, right? So to anticipate a little bit what we're probably going to get on to discuss, you have figures who we might think of as theologians, who are engaged in what very clearly seem to be philosophical debates, but within a larger theological framework, where ultimately what they're trying to do is understand or defend the Islamic revelation. And then you also have people who are pretty much by everyone called philosophers, like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, or Ibn Rushd, Averroes. And everyone agrees they're philosophers, but even those four people, Islam doesn't seem to play the same role in their thought. So Farabi never mentions Islam. He often seems to be alluding to it, but he never mentions it explicitly, not even once, I think. Maybe, but if so, I'm not thinking of the passage off the top of my head. Whereas Kindi is very explicitly using philosophy to interpret, so he interprets passages from the Quran, for example. He explicitly defends an Islamic conception of God using Greek materials, right? So there you have two very different approaches to Greek philosophy within only a couple of generations of each other, actually. You have two philosophers who are drawing heavily on the Greek tradition, who, at least on the surface, seem to be taking very different approaches to Islam. So I think that's not really a question that we can answer kind of across the board for all thinkers who are doing philosophy in the Islamic world. Some of them are very highly religiously motivated. Some of them think that religion is kind of a secondary issue, and a lot of people are sort of in between, I would say.
And in this regard, I remember Gutas claiming that philosophy was almost a byproduct after they were more interested in the practical matters, first being interested in Euclidean geometry or more practical sciences, if you may say. Then philosophy is almost as an unexpected product of the translation movement. Would you agree on this?
Yeah, I think he's exactly right about that. So, I mean, you have the translation movement from Greek via Syriac, which is another Semitic language, into Arabic. And that happens so it starts going in the 8th century BCE, goes into the 9th and 10th centuries. And I think it's true that their original motivation there is kind of political / pragmatic. So they're interested in medicine, they're interested in astronomy, they're interested in other sciences. And philosophy kind of comes in along with that because it's part of this big Hellenic cultural phenomenon, right? Notice that they're also translating and absorbing ideas from India. And in that case, they aren't particularly interested in Indian philosophy, right? So maybe some ideas from Indian philosophy creep in, but it doesn't really seem that anyone has any clue about Indian philosophy in a deep way in the Islamic world, into Biruni, who's a contemporary of Ibn Sina in the 10th, 11th centuries, right? So basically what they're interested in is science, almost in the sense that we would use that word. But you can't really disentangle science and mathematics, actually, from philosophy in the Greek tradition, so it just comes along with it. A very good example of this, by the way, is Galen. So people always think about Aristotle as the main author of the Greek-Arabic translation movement when it comes to philosophy, but actually I would almost go so far as to say that there's two main authors in the philosophical translation movement, namely Aristotle and Galen. And Galen, for those who don't know, is the main authority in ancient medicine. So he plays the same role in medicine that Aristotle does in philosophy. He's from the 2nd century CE, so he's a lot later. So he's like 500 years after Aristotle, 500-600 years. And his works are massively translated into Arabic. Basically, they translate everything they can get, just as they do with Aristotle. And Galen becomes actually a very important source for some people who are doing philosophy, because just as science, like zoology, cosmology, chemistry, and things like that, can't be disentangled from Aristotelian philosophy, medicine can't be disentangled from philosophy either. Galen even wrote a work called The Best Doctor is Also a Philosopher. So you could even imagine that maybe a Galenic approach to philosophy could have won out over the Aristotelian approach, which is not really what happened, but it was there, especially in the early centuries.
So they're, in a sense, embracing an entire culture, and while dealing with those different sciences, they start to produce something that is highly influenced by these other culture.
Yes.
And what was the things as constituting motivations in their circumstances to do so?
Well, this is a very debated question.
Yeah, I know.
And Gutas wrote a whole book about this, right? So there's a lot to say here. I mean, I think he's right to point to the pragmatic questions. I mean, mathematics, medicine, astrology, super useful, right? So if we think astrology works, then you can use it to tell the future. It doesn't get more useful than that, right? So that's certainly a factor. Then there also seems to be kind of competition with Byzantium. So something to remember here, people always think, oh, well, there's like Latin-speaking Europe and they're Christians, and there's Arabic-speaking Islamic world and they're mostly Muslims, right? But actually, that's not a good way of thinking about it at all, because the Latin-speaking world is a real afterthought from the point of view of the Islamic world, both culturally, like in the period we're interested in, like the 9th to 10th century, Western Europe is a complete backwater, right? But also just in terms of distance or geography, the nearby powerful Christian power for if you're living in like Syria or Iraq, which is where the translation movement happened, the Christian reference point would be Byzantium, right there in modern day Turkey. So they're right there. And in fact, they're fighting wars with them throughout this whole period. So even when they're not at war, there's a lot of tension. So there's quite a bit of cultural competition and one-upsmanship between the Muslims and the Christians. Byzantium already has been there for quite a while, basically since late antiquity. In fact, the Byzantines don't call themselves Byzantines, they call themselves Romans. Yeah. So they think of themselves as just the Roman Empire still, right? Here we are, we're still going, right? Ever since, as we have been ever since the Republic, the Roman Republic, right? That's us. And maybe surprisingly, Arabic speakers agree with this. So they call the Byzantines the Rum, right? Yeah. They don't call them Byzantini or something like that, right? That's really a later designation. And so the Muslims who have swept across this massive geographical expanse after the rise of Islam, and you have obviously the Muslim conquests, having achieved that, they now need to do things to achieve some kind of further goal, like political legitimacy, intellectual self-respect, and so on. And so one thought, which you can find in Gutas's book, and I think this is right, is that they wanted to present themselves as being kind of better caretakers of the Greek tradition than these Greek-speaking Christians were. So we're better at Greek philosophy than you guys, even though you speak Greek.
Yeah, right? I remember he mentioning some of the books of antiquity were left out in some non-used libraries, and they were not even interested in those. Yeah,
something that you often see is that the Christians prevented people from studying the entire course of Aristotle's logic. So they stop kind of halfway through the prior analytics, and they don't get to the really important part, which is the theory of demonstration. That's kind of a standard objection that's thrown at them. I do think there's something else going on here, though, which is clear if you look at Kindi, if you could go back to what I was saying about him. So he's 9th century. Yeah. So he's usually considered to be the first philosopher who's responding to the Greek tradition. And he is very clearly motivated by the desire to show that you can use Greek philosophy to establish the truth of Islam. So, and I think this is probably something that Gutas doesn't talk about so much in his book. So I would at least put a slightly different emphasis on what's going on and the motivations. I think that once philosophy was part of the story, which it already had been since the beginnings, because they were translating like works of logic early on. Once it was there and it was part of the story, immediately, just about, or within a generation or two, some intellectuals seized onto this Greek material and said, wait, we can use this metaphysics and theory of soul and argumentation theory and so on. We can use all that to try to argue for our religion. And there was a good reason why they wanted to do this, which is that, and this is something Gutas points out, it was a very kind of multi-religious community or context. So you have Kindi working together with Christian translators. You have Jews, Christians, Muslims all living together in the what we call the Middle East. And so it made a lot of sense, given that, for people to kind of use whatever intellectual weaponry they could find to support their own religion.
And I remember Heidegger mentioning in his classes about Kant that Kant, a bit speculatively, is putting Kant as the last medieval philosopher because
wow, that's really late. Okay.
yeah, he says that he was the last one in Europe to be concerned about the questions that the Christians were asking.
Wow.
And
Amazing.
he by himself ended that tradition of asking, oh, is there soul, or if soul is eternal, or can we prove God?
Right.
He puts him as that figure. Would you say within this tradition there is a similar tension between these philosophers trying to find a reality with using whatever tool they have from antiquity, sometimes, as you mentioned in Kindi's case, elaborating on Quran and Islamic tradition? Would you say they are at least negatively influenced by the tradition and the Islamic doctrines and try to overcome some of the problems? Or, there are accounts about this civic Muslims having new concerns now. Some of things are not really rational for them, and they're asking for solutions, and this is creating new narratives within Islam. Would you elaborate some?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think it depends which philosopher we're talking about here. If we stick with Kindi for a minute, actually one of the first things I ever wrote about Kindi was about the fact that in his works he seems to be indirectly addressing problems that were current in Islamic theology or kalam in his day. For example, when he talks about the eternity of the world, I suggested that was kind of an indirect way of talking about the debate over the eternity of the Quran, which was a big theological controversy during the Abbasid, under the Abbasid caliphs of his day. And there's some other things like the question of how things come to be from non-being, and the way he talks about divine attributes. So the terminology and also the problems that he chooses to focus on, I think are partially motivated by what was going on in Islamic theology at the time. If you then think of Farabi and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, they have a very specific position on this, which is that they think religion is a symbolic or rhetorical way of presenting truth, which is a truth more adequately grasped in philosophy. So, for example, if you want to prove that God exists, you need to use an Aristotelian proof, but the Quran will tell you that God exists and will kind of describe God using metaphorical language or saying that he sits upon a throne or something like that. And they suggest, especially Ibn Rushd says this very explicitly, that if you want to understand the truths that are being conveyed by the Quran, you actually have to do philosophy. So there you have this idea that philosophy even has precedence over religion because it grasps using demonstrative proofs what religion only expresses metaphorically, symbolically, rhetorically, right? I think that's an extremely rationalist position and is a very unusual position in the Islamic world, to the point where maybe they were the only two people ever to have thought that or to have expressed it quite that explicitly. Maybe Maimonides thinks something like that in the Jewish tradition. An interesting question is what Ibn Sina would have said about this. He's never that explicit about this. So I think with Ibn Sina, personally, I think that his project was a bit more like Kindi's in the sense that he's aware of all of these ongoing controversies in Kalam and Islamic theology. And he says, okay, I can see what you guys are doing here. You're all terribly confused because you're not using the right intellectual machinery to answer these questions. But I will come along and clarify everything, and I will solve all these problems. And he is, I think, unlike Kindi in another way, though, which is that he no longer thinks of himself primarily as just kind of carrying on the Hellenic tradition and showing how Greek philosophy can support Islam. That's not his project. His project is to become the new Aristotle, but he's becoming the new Aristotle in a way that responds to everything that's going on around him in Islamic theology. And I think here, by the way, it's maybe worth remembering that, so people often think, well, okay, there's falsafa, which is Greek-inspired philosophy. Even the word falsafa comes from Greek, right? And there's kalam, and that's like rational theology, right? So these are these sort of two competing intellectual traditions, right? Which is true in a way, but for every one philosophe, there's like 100 mutakalimun, right? So kalam is much more culturally dominant than falsafa. Falsafa was never more than a kind of minor, sort of marginal development, which we're very interested in because it was influential in Latin using Christian Europe, and because it carries on the Aristotelian and Platonist tradition. So we find that very interesting as historians. And of course, I find it very interesting. I've worked on it a lot. But I don't think that, I mean, one should not make the mistake of thinking that falsafa was like some hegemonic, dominant intellectual paradigm in the Islamic world. I don't think it was ever that. Until Ibn Sina comes along and shows how Greek thought can be used to answer this wide range of questions that arose from Islamic theology. And then people started taking it really seriously. So it's really only at that point where Ibn Sina sort of fuses the problems of kalam with Aristotelian style and also very original of his own making solutions to those problems. It's only then that something that we might think of as falsafa becomes sort of central and becomes able to really dominate intellectual discussions for the following centuries, because that's how I would see it.
And how would you define explain the different schools having tension so high as that they're like claiming each other to not be Muslims anymore, like takfiring each other.
Yeah.
And I am coming from a local standpoint in Turkey. You know, you have universities named after each of these people who were in some cases highly against each other. And at least the general Turkish crowd thinks that, okay, if this person is a mystic, they have a room for saying some controversial things about Islam because we are never understanding them fully.
We don't know what they're talking about anyway. So.
And if they are like a scientist, let's say, like Ibn Sina, then okay, sometimes hard facts are going beyond the more spiritual accounts, and we are again saying, okay, they were just doing fine. But actually, like, maybe you might mention, like, for instance, Ghazali and Ibn Sina, or like many others were heavily against each other's world perspectives, up to the point that they were thinking the death of the other is what is right.
Yeah, but I think that Ghazali is not just kind of a famous example of that.
Yeah.
Actually, that's new. So, I mean, I'm kind of following the lead of Frank Griffel here because he's written a book about it. And he argues that up until Ghazali wrote Tahfud al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, no one had ever said, oh, you're a fakir because you believe X, Y, and Z in philosophy, right? So that accusation of being an apostate or somehow violating the dictates of Islam was not really one that was thrown around at philosophers before Ghazali. I mean, it was thrown around at people for various reasons, but not because of their philosophical positions. There was certainly plenty of debate, but the debate seems to have all been kind of within the realm of acceptable intellectual disputation, right? So for an interesting example here is that when there's this grammarian named Sirafi who attacked one of the members of the Baghdad Aristotelian school and polemicized against the use of Greek logic and philosophy. This is back in the 10th century. And he's attacking a Christian there, not a Muslim. And he makes fun of him for being a Christian. So he says, oh, you think the same thing can be both 1 and 3, and yet you say you're good at logic, right? So he kind of teases him for being a Christian, but he never says that these Christians are introducing ideas into Islam which are somehow going to lead to heresy or somehow undermine Islam. He just says, this is pedantic, this is a waste of time, we don't need this, we've got grammar, why would we need logic, right? That's basically his position. And I think you could sort of go through the whole history of inter-philosophical and inter-theological debates before Ghazali without finding people saying, well, because you adopt such and such a thesis, you are not a Muslim, you are an apostate, right? Mostly, as far as I can tell, the Mutakallimun basically just call each other idiots and say, well, you're wrong, right? And your argument doesn't even make any sense and whatever. But I don't think that they tend to accuse each other of being non-Muslim.
Maybe later in in tension with Tasawwuf people, like
for sure.
Hallaj Mansur.
Hallaj, But I think Hallaj is different because he's a Sufi, right? So I'm talking about like debates on technical philosophical questions, like, oh, well, you think that non-existent items are real before God creates them, therefore you're a heretic, right? They don't say that. Actually, having said that, there's this philosopher who I had in mind earlier when I said that Galen was very influential in the Islamic world. So there's this guy, Abu Bakr al-Razi, who I wrote a book about. And actually people do call him a heretic because he said that there were other eternal principles alongside God, right? But really, I think it's still the case that al-Ghazali represents a sort of watershed moment where he says, well, these philosophical positions, and he itemizes which positions he has in mind, these count as kufr, and you cannot say these things. If you say these things, then you deserve to be killed, right? But having said that, so he says that, so he dies in 1111, so like 1.5 centuries after the death of Ibn Sina, and by the time he says that, Ibn Sina has already become the most influential philosopher in the Islamic world, and he becomes even more influential after that. So even though Ghazali says this guy is unacceptable, he's bad news, Ghazali actually keeps a lot of his ideas. He says it would be ridiculous to reject his logic, and a lot of his natural philosophy is correct, and so on. And then what happens after that is that Ibn Sina's metaphysics, his theory of soul, his logic, and so on, become the main thing that everyone's debating in the 12th and 13th centuries. Not that everyone thinks that he's right, but he's the only person that not the only person, but he's the person they most think is worth responding to.
And a more simple question, what were the main philosophical interests that find, let's say, answers in the Greek tradition that they wanted to bring?
Well, actually, it might almost be easier to try to itemize the things they're not interested in, because basically the answer to the question is everything. So everything that they do in Greek philosophy, they do in Arabic philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy, and so on. The thing that they're maybe least well informed about is political philosophy, because they don't have Aristotle's Politics, or they don't have it for the most part. There's an interesting text by Ibn Rushd, where he's commenting on Plato's Republic by summarizing a text that he already has only in summary form. So he doesn't have the whole Republic translated into Arabic. He's probably got a translation of Galen's summary of Plato's Republic. Again, Galen being a very important conduit for philosophy. And he's at the beginning of Ibn Rushd's summary of this summary, he says, well, at this point, I would have liked to comment on Aristotle's Politics, but I don't have it. So I will just write about Plato's Republic instead as a kind of substitute, which from our point of view is very weird, right? But he does say this. And there's some uncertainty about what al-Farabi had in terms of Greek political philosophy. So it's not that they're not interested in it, they are, but their access to it is more limited. Whereas they've got multiple translations of the metaphysics. They've got De Anima, they've got the entire sequence of logical works. They've got Aristotle's Zoology. They've got other natural works, or works of natural philosophy from Aristotle, like the Meteorology, on generation and corruption, on the heavens. They basically have almost all the same Aristotle we do, in fact. And then they've got summaries of a lot of Platonic dialogues from Galen. they've got Galen himself, who writes a lot about philosophy, and then they have works by the Neoplatonists, Plotinus and Proclus. So they're extremely well informed about Greek philosophy. They are better informed about Greek philosophy than people in Latin Christendom were. So in Western Europe, let's say, they knew more about that than people in Western Europe did until the Renaissance. So it was not really until I think probably the 15th century where they kind of caught up with where Muslims were in the 10th century.
About this question, I have in mind, for instance, in Aristotle, we find some hierarchy. I don't know if you would agree, between different parts of philosophy, and the highest truths will be the highest causes or the most primary ones. And maybe in some Islamic figures, this also becomes, in a sense, equal to God in their particular understanding of the Islamic God. And would you say that there is such hierarchy, and if so, how it shapes their general outtake of the...
So that's a good question. It's a very complicated issue. Maybe start with the simple thing. Aristotle says in a passage in the Metaphysics that there are three sciences that are arranged in a kind of hierarchy, like you say. So you've got physics, which studies things that are in bodies, so bodies and their properties. Then you've got mathematics, which studies properties of bodies which we've abstracted away from the material, like, shapes, lengths, quantity. And then we've got what we might call metaphysics. He uses the word theology, actually, theologia, for this, which studies things that are not in bodies, right? i.e. divine principles, right? So that gives you a very clear rank ordering. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that from Aristotle's logical works, and especially the posterior analytics, they can get the idea that the sciences should somehow be arranged in a kind of tree, or again, a kind of hierarchy, where higher sciences provide principles to lower sciences. So the example people always give here is that geometry provides principles that are used in optics. So if you're doing optics, you don't prove Euclidean geometrical theorems, right? You just take all the results of geometry for granted, and then you do your optics, right? If you're studying how things look in mirrors or something, right? So that's a nice example of this. And then there's this idea that the highest science would have to be metaphysics or theology. And then that would provide principles for everything else. So for example, natural philosophy, which studies physical bodies, would somehow take its principles from metaphysics. And then what that means is an interesting question. One thing it could mean is what you just said, which is that in metaphysics we learn about God, and God is the cause of the physical world, right? Aristotle thought something like that, although he certainly didn't think it was true in the sense that people who are members of Abrahamic religions think it's true. But there's enough there for them to work with that they can kind of develop this idea further. I think that the people who really developed that in the Islamic world are the members of the Baghdad school, the Aristotelians in the 10th century, and especially Farabi. So Farabi has this very elaborate idea, and he comes back to it again and again. He's really interested in the question of how the sort of philosophical curriculum works, how the sciences build on each other, ascend to a first science, which provides principles for all the others. That's his whole project. That's his idea. Whereas with Kindi, you don't really see that at all, probably because he didn't yet have a translation of the posterior analytics. So he didn't know about the whole theory of the hierarchy of the sciences.